You ever notice how the scariest kind of control doesn't look like control? It doesn't come with sirens or shackles, no loud orders, no boots on the ground. Instead, it comes with soft voices, polished suits, and words like inclusion, progress, trust, stakeholders. Freedom used to mean the ability to say no. Now it means the ability to opt in, as long as you opt into what's been pre-approved. That's not chains, that's choreography. Maybe the real power today doesn't silence you, it shapes what you want to say. That's where this story begins. Not with a conspiracy or some shadowy group pulling strings, but with something far quieter. A shift in tone, in language, in the way we talk about crisis and what comes after. You've probably heard the phrase, the Great Reset. Some people say it's a plot to take over the world. Others say it's just a smart plan to make capitalism less cruel. But that binary misses something deeper. What if the Great Reset isn't a plan at all? What if it's a story? One designed not to control by force, but to guide by feeling. To take something messy and frightening, like climate collapse, inequality, or a pandemic, and give it structure. A beginning, middle, and end. A hero, a villain, a moral. Because if there's one thing humans cling to in chaos, it's meaning. We don't just want things to get better. We want it to feel justified. We want to believe we're all in it together, moving towards some noble goal. And when institutions learn how to supply that belief, when they get good at it, they don't need to rule with iron. They can rule with narrative. This isn't about them versus us. It's about how power has evolved. It's subtler now, more psychological, less about what you're allowed to do, more about what you're encouraged to feel. Less prison walls, more persuasive words. Less surveillance, more curated hope. And that's the danger, isn't it? Not that someone's pulling the strings, but that we're too emotionally disarmed to see the strings at all. So, this isn't a call to panic. It's not another what they don't want you to know video. It's slower than that. More curious. We're not trying to debunk a scheme. We're trying to read a script. Because somewhere along the way, crisis stopped being something to endure. It became something to frame, to package, to sell. And behind all the speeches, slogans, and shiny proposals, something shifted. Maybe it's not a reset of systems. Maybe it's a reset of minds. Let's slow down a second. Before we go too far, let's be honest about something. People crave stories more than they crave truth. Not because they're stupid, because stories are how we survive uncertainty. They give chaos a shape. They make fear bearable. Now think about the Great Reset. Forget for a moment the policies, the white papers, the shiny websites. Strip all that back. What you're left with is a narrative arc. Things were bad, then crisis hit. Now, with courage and cooperation, we build something better. It's not a policy. It's a parable. That's not a bug. It's the design. The people writing this story aren't trying to win debates. They're trying to control the frame. And whoever owns the frame doesn't have to argue. They just steer. This is where George Lakoff comes in. The cognitive linguist who said, basically, don't argue within your opponent's frame. Reframe the whole thing. If I say don't think of an elephant, your brain gives you an elephant anyway. That's framing. It bypasses logic. It hits you before thought. So when world leaders say we're reimagining capitalism or that Build Back Better is a shared global mission, they're not just tossing buzzwords. They're giving you the elephant. They're laying down the first bricks of a new narrative frame. And the funny part? The frame looks harmless. It looks good. That's the whole point. See, Noam Chomsky would tell you, it's not that propaganda tells you what to think. It's that it defines what's thinkable. It draws the map of acceptable discussion. So now, rethinking the economy means doing it their way, on their timeline, with their language. You're not locked in a room. You're just taught that the room is the whole world. That's the sleight of hand. The reset tells a story that sounds inclusive and visionary, but quietly sets the limits of what's allowed inside that vision. It builds emotional guardrails. And here's the kicker. It makes you feel like you belong. This isn't some James Bond villain with a monocle plotting in a lair. This is strategy by metaphor. It's we're all in this together meets you will own nothing and be happy. It's sleek videos and moral urgency wrapped around financial restructuring and governance shifts, and we eat it up. because it gives us something to believe in when everything else feels like it's crumbling. You know how during a breakup your brain scrambles to make sense of it all, to find a storyline that helps you move on? This is like that, but scaled to civilization. Crisis hits. We panic. The people with the megaphone say, "Here's how the story goes now." And they speak with calm voices, with graphics and goals and hashtags, and it all feels safe, hopeful. But ask yourself, who wrote the script? And why are they the only ones holding the pen? Here's a weird question to ask out loud. What if power doesn't always look like power? What if sometimes it grins at you, wraps itself in morality, offers you safety, even flatters your conscience? That's the thing about modern influence. It doesn't scream. It persuades. It comforts. It guides. And you don't even feel the pull because it wears the language of compassion. Foucault talked about this a long time ago. He said power isn't just something that represses us. It's something that produces us. It doesn't just tell us no. It teaches us how to behave, how to desire, how to be a certain kind of person. And you can really see that in the way the Great Reset talks. It's not, "Here's what we're taking away." It's, "Here's how we're going to help you." You're not being told what to do. You're being told you're part of something historic, something moral. Listen to the phrases inclusive capitalism, equitable futures, stakeholder engagement, building resilient social justice in business. These aren't instructions. They're invitations. You're not being ruled. You're being engaged. But ask yourself, engaged on whose terms? At Davos, you'll see it all dressed up. Billionaires on stage talking about sustainability, CEOs promising to center purpose over profit. It feels like justice. But the people saying it, are they stepping down, giving up control, or just changing the costume? They're not handing over power, they're just reframing it. So it looks cleaner, softer, noble. They moralize their dominance, and that's the trap. Because once power becomes moral, questioning it becomes immoral. If the plan is to save the planet, who are you to resist? If the language is about inclusion and compassion, then your skepticism must mean you don't care. You're negative, you're selfish, you're part of the problem. It flips the script. Now resistance feels like betrayal, not just of policy, but of humanity. That's not just clever, that's dangerous. Because it creates a world where top-down control doesn't need enforcement. It just needs applause. People comply not because they're afraid, but because they believe. Or at least they want to look like they do. This is why Foucault matters. He's not saying power has disappeared. He's saying it's moved inward, into the way we think, speak, vote, consume, even post online. And so we end up with something weirdly elegant. Domination disguised as elevation. You don't feel forced, you feel chosen. This kind of framing works because it hijacks your sense of moral clarity. You want to do the right thing. They know that. So they package the plan in words you already agree with. What's left to oppose? If I walk into a room and say, "We're going to make things fair and sustainable and human-centered," who wants to be the guy who says no? But what if I'm not asking for fairness? What if I'm asking for submission to a system that will define fairness for you? That's how the smiling mask works. It makes obedience feel like virtue, and virtue feel like inevitability. So the next time you hear someone in a high tower talk about reform, don't just listen for what they say they're fixing. Listen for the tone, the benevolence, the calm certainty. And then ask, what kind of power needs to sound that kind in order to be accepted? Because the more beautiful the words, the more carefully you should read the contract. You ever notice how every time something huge goes wrong, economy crashes, virus spreads, war breaks out, there's always someone with a blueprint ready? Like while the rest of us are frozen or grieving or broke, some think tank, foundation, or global summit is already a few steps ahead, armed with terms like restructuring, recovery, and resilience. It's not coincidence, it's choreography. Naomi Klein calls this the shock doctrine. The basic idea is simple. When people are stunned by fear, by loss, by chaos, they become pliable. That's when the fixers move in. Not to heal, but to shape. And the shapes they choose? They're rarely bottom up. They don't come from the neighborhoods or the nurses or the single dads trying to keep the lights on. They come from boardrooms, from places like Davos. Now take COVID. We were told this was the moment to pause and rethink everything. And to be fair, that idea had power. Who wouldn't want to rebuild something better after a global crisis? But look closer at who was doing the rethinking. It wasn't some open public forum. It wasn't democratic. It wasn't even transparent. It was a small circle of economic and political elites saying, "This is our window of opportunity." Those were Klaus Schwab's words, not ours. A narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. Sounds inspiring, right? Like we're standing at the edge of a turning point. But here's the uncomfortable part. Who gets to define what better means? And reimagine for whom? Because that matters. You can paint a utopia with all the right colors. Equity, sustainability, inclusion, and still hide the fact that the blueprint was drawn by the same people who designed the mess in the first place. You can promise a gentler capitalism, while quietly ensuring the rules still work in your favor. That's what Klein was warning about. Crises aren't just dangerous because of what they destroy. They're dangerous because of what they clear the path for. And COVID cleared a lot of paths. It fast-tracked digital ID systems, remote biometric surveillance, centralized data infrastructures, supply chain consolidations, none of which were widely voted on or debated in public squares. Most of it happened while we were just trying to stay safe. People weren't thinking about global governance. They were thinking about their grandparents. And that's the trick. If you want to redesign a system without too much resistance, wait until everyone's focused on survival. Then, while they're still catching their breath, release the new rules with a smile. This isn't a movie villain rubbing their hands together. It's more subtle. It's more polite. It's more effective. Because when you can frame massive structural change as a moral necessity, when you can say, "We can't go back to the old normal," you don't have to explain who benefits from the new one. You just say, "We're all in this together." Again. But no one really breaks down what together means when the tables were already uneven before the storm hit. So yeah, the shock doctrine still applies, just with sleeker branding now. It's not jackboots, it's keynote speeches, not barbed wire, it's biometric wellness apps. Not riots in the streets, it's quiet compliance in the cloud. And the genius of it all? Most of it gets rolled out as if it's for your own good. Because who wants to be the person who says no to progress? To safety? To building back better? But sometimes better is just a softer word for obedient. That's why it matters who tells the story. That's why the timing is everything. When people are scared, the easiest lie to sell is the one dressed like a solution. And when the dust settles, nobody really remembers the debate, just the outcome. There's a trick to getting people to agree with things they might otherwise question. It's not fear, it's hope. Hope is softer, less obvious. But in the hands of institutions, it can be just as powerful as panic. Maybe more. See, after any major crisis, pandemic, recession, war, there's this collective hunger to believe again. People want to rebuild. They want meaning. They want to feel like they're part of something good, something redemptive. That's when the slogans show up. Build back better. A fairer, greener future. Together we can reimagine the world. Sounds nice, right? It's supposed to. But this is where language does its real work. Not by lying, but by framing. George Lakoff would say this is how metaphors shape thought. When you say rebuild, you're already assuming the previous system is rubble. When you say better, you're implying that whatever comes next is an upgrade. And when you say we, you've already lumped everyone into the same emotional position, even though their material positions couldn't be more different. The problem isn't the words themselves. It's how those words get used to dull the edge of doubt. When everything's coated in moral sugar, resilience, solidarity, shared values, people stop asking real questions. Like, who's leading this rebuild? What exactly are we giving up? What choices are being made behind closed doors while the rest of us are encouraged to feel inspired? That's what optimism can do when it's manufactured. It puts you in a passive state. Because if you criticize the better, you sound bitter. If you question the hope, you seem cynical. So instead of speaking up, you nod along. You repost the graphics, you click the heart, and slowly, without noticing, your sense of scrutiny gets smoothed over by aesthetics and tone. You're not being silenced, you're being soothed. It's like being led into a garden. The air smells nice, the lighting is soft, everything's calm, and before you realize it, the gate behind you has quietly shut. Not locked, just expected to stay closed. That's the genius of framing with hope. It makes resistance feel unnecessary, even rude. You don't have to agree, but why wouldn't you? Everyone else seems inspired. Everyone else is smiling in the videos. Everyone else is leaning into the new vision. And here's the kicker. You actually want to believe it too. Because life's been hard. You're tired. You're over the doom cycles. You want something that feels like healing. But when optimism is packaged and distributed by the same people who benefit from your quiet, you have to pause. You have to ask, what am I not seeing behind this warm light? Because real hope doesn't need branding. Real change doesn't rely on emotional choreography. If something is truly better, it can stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't need to guilt you into agreement. So the next time you feel that soft pull, that lift from a speech, a quote, a clever hashtag, just hold it in your hand for a second. Turn it over. Ask who wrote it. Ask who's funding it. Ask who's absent from the photo. And if the answers are blurry, that's your clue. Hope can heal, but it can also distract. And when you're distracted, you don't notice what you're walking into, only how good the lighting looks on the way in. There's a moment when power doesn't just defend itself, it rebrands. It doesn't shrink or apologize. It changes costumes, puts on something more flattering, more digestible, something that looks like justice. That's where stakeholder capitalism enters the picture. On paper, it sounds like progress, a move away from old-school shareholder capitalism, where profit ruled everything, to something more inclusive, something that takes the planet, the workers, the communities into account. Everyone's a stakeholder now, but let's be real. Do you honestly think the same people who spent decades chasing quarterly profits suddenly woke up and said, you know what? Let's center humanity today? It's not that sudden. It's not that generous. What happened is this. The old story started to crack. People got angry. Inequality exploded. Climate disasters got harder to ignore. Workers pushed back. Consumers paid attention. And the institutions, governments, corporations, global forums, had two choices. Change the system or change the narrative. They chose the narrative. So now we get executives talking about purpose over profit. Now we get mission statements filled with compassion. Now we get terms like ESG, environmental, social, governance, used as moral currency. But here's the part they skip. Stakeholder capitalism doesn't redistribute power. It just talks differently while holding on to it. Take Klaus Schwab's book, Stakeholder Capitalism. It paints this hopeful picture where businesses serve the common good. But there's a gap between the language and the architecture, because the decisions, still made by a tiny layer of CEOs, boardrooms, and policymakers who weren't elected by anyone but themselves. You and I don't get to decide what sustainability looks like. We just get told what version of it is going to happen, and why it's our responsibility to support it. That's what makes this version of capitalism feel more like a performance. It's corporate morality theater. Everyone on stage. Nice lighting, good scripts, but the audience doesn't get a vote. We just clap. Anand Giridharadas nailed this in Winners Take All. He said the same elites who caused the problems are now marketing themselves as the solution, not by giving up their influence, but by moralizing it. Turning power into charity, turning wealth into virtue. It's not that they want to fix the world. They want to manage the fix. They want to lead the revolution without ever stepping down from their podiums. That's why so many world-changing initiatives still route through the same networks. Global finance, multinational partnerships, Silicon Valley platforms, institutional foundations. It's a closed loop of influence with open-door language. So what do you call a system that keeps the structure the same, but changes the slogans? You call it a rebrand. This is the corporate version of a costume change backstage. We're not greedy anymore, we're green. We're not extractive, we're inclusive. We're not opaque, we're accountable. As long as we get to define what accountable means. It's the same engine under the hood. But now the hood has a mural of a forest on it. And look, I'm not saying every person involved in this shift is fake. Some mean it. Some really want better outcomes, but intention isn't the issue. Mechanism is. And the mechanism hasn't changed. Capital still moves where capital wants. Decisions still flow top down. And every time you think there's finally a seat at the table, you realize the menu's already been written. So next time you hear stakeholder, pause. Ask yourself who gets to be one, who isn't in the room, who owns the microphone, and whether the system inviting you to participate actually plans to listen or just wants to say it tried. Because inclusion without influence, that's just decoration. You know that moment when someone asks for your opinion, but you can already tell the decision's been made? That's what modern participation often feels like. Not dialogue, not co-creation, just well-lit theater. And the Great Reset leans hard into this. The messaging is all about inclusion. Everyone must play a role. Diverse voices. Global citizens. You see it in every video clip, every panel, every mission statement. A mosaic of faces, accents, flags. It feels like the world is finally being brought to the table. But ask, who owns the table? Because what they're really offering isn't power, it's performance. Here's the pattern. The elite institutions open a platform, invite a mix of perspectives, run a few community engagements, maybe spotlight some local leaders, and then carry on with the original plan. It's decision-making with a comment section. Hannah Arendt warned about this kind of thing. She said totalitarian systems don't always silence people. Sometimes they flood the zone with participation, petitions, councils, forums, while stripping those actions of consequence. People feel heard, but the outcomes are already boxed in. And that's where the illusion sets in. When everyone's invited to speak but no one gets to steer, the system isn't democratic, it's decorative. You'll hear phrases like consultation process or multi-stakeholder dialogue, but rarely see who sets the agenda, who filters the input, who translates it into policy. It's like asking a room full of people what kind of cake they want, and then saying, "Thanks, we're serving salad." And here's the thing, most people won't push back. Not because they don't care, but because participation itself feels like progress. It feels like something is moving, like history is being shaped together. We want to believe that being asked to join means being asked to matter. But inclusion without redistribution isn't justice. It's optics. You see it in corporate DEI panels, in global NGO partnerships, in curated conversations with youth leaders flown in for photos, then flown back out while the real work continues elsewhere. None of this means those voices aren't valuable, of course they are. But the problem is structural. It's the technocratic layer between participation and power. The spreadsheets, the frameworks, the timelines, all managed by people fluent in a certain language, policy speak, funding logic, PR calibration, and that language decides what counts. If your voice doesn't translate into that dialect, it gets praised, documented, then gently ignored. Participation becomes something to show, not something that shifts the design. So what you get is this: the illusion of influence, a sense of movement without direction, a group photo that says, "Look how far we've come," while the same hands hold the wheel. Jacques Ellul wrote about this too. He said propaganda doesn't always lie. It often tells partial truths, and the most effective kind tells you what you want to hear while nudging you just slightly off course. So you don't resist, you internalize. That's what this is. A system that lets you feel included but keeps the architecture intact. And look, maybe it's not all malicious. Maybe some people inside really believe the process works. But belief doesn't equal transformation. You can say, we value every voice 100 times. If none of those voices ever change the outcome, what are we really doing? So when you hear calls for collaboration, don't just ask who's in the room. Ask who built the room. Ask who wrote the agenda. And ask whether the people included are just there to make the system look alive, while the real levers stay untouched. Because sometimes the show isn't for the audience, it's for the mirror. There is no vaccine for the planet. That's an actual line used by world leaders to describe the climate crisis. It sounds poetic, right? Urgent, evocative. But look a little closer and it carries something else too. A pressure, a subtle edge. That line doesn't just raise awareness, it corners you. Because if there's no cure, then there's no time, no debate, no alternative. Just act. Now. And if you hesitate, well, maybe you're the problem. This is what I mean by manufactured urgency. It's not that the issues aren't real, they are. The climate is breaking. Inequality is brutal. Systems are wobbling. But urgency, when it's weaponized, stops being about clarity and starts being about control. It changes the terms. Suddenly, you're not just a citizen. You're a potential obstacle. You're not asked to think. You're asked to comply, fast. It's all framed as moral logic. There's no time to wait. History won't forgive delay. The science is settled. And maybe it is. But the way those statements are used, it's less about informing you and more about closing the door behind you. You can feel it in how the messaging shifts. At first it's educational, then it's emotional, then it's absolute. You go from "this is a problem" to "this is the only solution." Anything else, any pause, any alternate route, is labeled as denial or apathy or regression. And it happens fast, because urgency collapses the space between question and answer. Giorgio Agamben warned about this kind of pattern. He called it the state of exception, a temporary suspension of normal rules justified by emergency. A just-for-now mindset that keeps getting extended. You see it in history. Wartime surveillance that never fully goes away. Emergency powers that quietly become policy. Centralized decisions that bypass the mess of democracy because we can't afford to waste time. And people accept it. Not because they're dumb, but because the fear is real. That's what makes soft coercion so effective. It doesn't silence you, it just puts a timer on your thought process. You still get to choose, but under pressure, with urgency whispering that delay equals doom. And in that mental rush, something subtle dies. Nuance. The ability to hold conflicting truths, to ask complicated questions, to push back on the official how without being treated like you're denying the why. Because the framing is so tight, so airtight, that any critique sounds like sabotage. This is how moral urgency becomes a trap. You're not forced to agree. But if you don't agree fast enough, you're painted as indifferent. Or worse, dangerous. It creates a false binary. You're either with the future or you're holding it back. There's no space to ask who designed the future, or why the timeline just happens to benefit the same entities that set the fire in the first place. This isn't some evil mastermind thing, it's just how systems preserve themselves. They swap out complexity for clarity, doubt for duty. And we fall for it because it's exhausting to question everything while the house is burning. But here's the catch. Once you accept urgency as a reason to bypass process, you can justify almost anything. We had to centralize control. There wasn't time. We had to skip transparency. There wasn't time. We had to override that community. There wasn't time. And once that logic settles in, it doesn't leave. It just waits for the next crisis. So yeah, emergencies are real. But so is the danger of permanent emergency logic. Next time you hear that familiar tone, that breathless call to act before it's too late, breathe for a second. Ask what's being fast-tracked. Ask who profits from the urgency. And ask whether the solution is truly about survival or about obedience. Most people, when they imagine control, think Orwell. They picture jackboots, telescreens, blacklists, brutal, obvious stuff. The kind that breaks bones and bans books, but control doesn't always come with a fist. Sometimes it comes with a feed, a dopamine loop, a soft voice in your pocket reminding you that you chose this. That's not Orwell, that's Huxley. In Brave New World, the dystopia doesn't burn books. It makes people not want to read them. Doesn't ban speech, just buries it under pleasure and noise. People aren't ruled by fear. They're pacified by comfort, novelty, entertainment, ease. Sound familiar? Neil Postman picked up on this decades ago. He wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death, a warning that the real threat to critical thinking wasn't censorship, it was distraction. And here we are, eyes locked on endless scroll, minds splintered by stimulus, ideas reduced to content reduced to seconds. And while all that's happening, structures shift. Policies pass, algorithms evolve, public discourse narrows, but no one notices because they're busy being engaged. With clips, with trends, with personal brands, with outrage. You don't have to silence a population that's too preoccupied to speak. And that's the subtle genius of modern power. It doesn't stop you from expressing yourself, it just funnels your expression into places that don't matter. You get to vent, to tweet, to comment, to feel seen, but the systems stay the same. And if you ever start to ask why things feel off, why your choices feel empty, your freedom feels choreographed, your beliefs feel preloaded, you're handed a new podcast, a new documentary, a new campaign to support, you're always entertained, always occupied, never quite clear. Because clarity is dangerous. Clarity leads to pattern recognition. Pattern recognition leads to resistance. But resistance is hard when everything feels nice, smooth, tailored, personalized, optimized for you. That's the brilliance of consensual control. You don't have to obey. You just slowly prefer not to question. And when you do question, you don't get silenced. You get distracted. You get offered another worldview, another identity, another side to pick. So you stay inside the system, just fighting over which color it wears. It's like arguing about the decor of a locked room. Meanwhile, outside the noise, the architecture of power hums quietly, adapts, monetizes, reinvents itself under banners like inclusion, engagement, open dialogue. But it's not dialogue, not really. It's a simulation of one. Because the moment your dissent threatens anything real, anything structural, it gets smoothed out. Not crushed, just absorbed. You're offered a job, a panel, a partnership. Or if that fails, you're drowned in algorithmic mud. Not erased, just buried under noise until your sharp edges go dull. This is what Postman meant when he said we wouldn't need Big Brother, we'd get big friendly. And that friendliness, it's addictive. Because it gives you just enough freedom to feel alive, but not enough to do anything unpredictable. That's the sweet spot for modern systems of control. Maximum compliance with minimum force. A world where people are so busy feeling heard, they forget to ask who's actually listening. A world where the illusion of choice becomes a kind of leash. Flexible, invisible, strong. So if you feel like something's off, you're not crazy. If you feel like the room's getting smaller even as your options expand, you're onto something. Because control today isn't about removing your voice. It's about making sure that voice echoes back exactly what the system wants to hear. Let's not wrap this up with some neat little bow. That'd be a lie. You don't just snap out of this kind of thing. You don't watch one video and suddenly become immune to narrative framing or soft power or emotional engineering. That's not how any of this works. What we've been talking about isn't a system to overthrow. It's not even a system you can always see. It's a mindset, a rhythm, a way the world slowly teaches you what to care about and how loudly you're allowed to care. So if you're waiting for some big resistance blueprint, you'll be disappointed. Because resistance today isn't flags or fire, it's quieter, slower, sometimes lonelier. It's sitting with discomfort instead of rushing toward a shiny answer. It's watching how language is used on you, how it nudges you to agree, to repost, to cheer for things you haven't even fully thought through. It's noticing when urgency is being used to smuggle in decisions you didn't get to vote on. It's pulling your attention back from the scroll, not to disconnect, but to reclaim direction. Because if you don't guide where your attention goes, someone else will. And chances are, they already are. Resistance now might mean reading more than you post, listening longer than you react, asking, wait, who benefits from this? Even when the message feels good, especially when it feels good. It might mean disappointing people, opting out, being labeled difficult or negative or too intense. But honestly, you're not too intense. The world just got too light, too curated, too afraid of sharp questions. The Great Reset, if we even want to call it that, isn't about locking you down. It's about guiding you gently into a worldview. One that feels moral, feels modern, feels inevitable. So maybe resistance is about pulling back the inevitability, sitting with the weirdness of being aware, letting go of the need to solve everything, and instead staying awake enough not to be absorbed. No flashy rebellion, just attention, disciplined attention, sustained curiosity, the kind that doesn't flinch when the answers get uncomfortable, because honestly, the scariest thing isn't being controlled. It's being conditioned to love the control, to feel comforted by it, to call it progress. But it's not all doom. If anything, the fact that you're still here, still watching, still thinking, that's the start. That's the thing systems like this fear most. Not rage, not noise, but refusal. Refusal to nod along. Refusal to go numb. Refusal to let the script write you in as an extra when you were always meant to be aware. So no, we're not fighting some master plan. We're not exposing secrets. We're doing something harder. We're watching the narrative and choosing not to sleepwalk through it. Maybe that's the shift. Not a reset of the world, a reset of ourselves.